Bernie Madoff didn't look like a fraud. He looked like safety. No loud promises, no flashy pitch, just calm, steady returns that made investors feel protected while the market turned chaotic around them. That was the danger. Because behind the reputation, the statements, and the trust, there was no real investing engine, just a giant lie that worked till people all tried to get their money back at once. In this video, I'll show you how the biggest fraud in history actually worked and why so many smart people believed it for so long. First, you need to understand why Madoff seems so legitimate, who Madoff was. To understand the fraud, you have to understand the cover. Bernie Madoff was not some outsider pretending to belong on Wall Street. He actually belonged. At least in one part of his business, he was the real thing. He founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities in 1960. At first, it was a legitimate broker-dealer operation. Over time, it grew into a serious trading business. Madoff helped build electronic trading systems during a period when markets were changing fast. He became a respected figure in the industry. He even served as chairman of NASDAQ. That detail matters more than people realize, because when someone has that kind of resume, most people stop asking the first layer of questions. They don't think, "Show me how this works." They think, "Well, obviously this works. Look who's running it." That's how reputation becomes camouflage. And the physical setup of the firm helped too. If you visited the office in Manhattan, you saw what looked like a legitimate financial institution. Busy trading operations, real employees, real systems, real activity. The respectable part of the business was visible. It was functioning. It gave the whole firm an institutional smell: carpets, glass, old money, professional confidence, the kind of place that quietly tells people you are in safe hands. Meanwhile, the fraudulent investment advisory business was kept more insulated. Think about what that does psychologically. A wealthy investor visits, sees a serious operation, hears that Madoff is connected, established, deeply embedded in the market, and all the messy human work of skepticism starts fading. Nobody feels like they're walking into a scam. They feel like they're walking into the adult table. That's the first reason the fraud lasted. It didn't need to invent credibility from scratch. It borrowed credibility from the parts of Madoff's world that were actually real. How it worked. At the core, the scheme was almost insultingly simple. New investors gave Madoff money. Instead of investing that money the way clients were told, he used a large portion of it to pay withdrawals to earlier investors. Then his operation sent out account statements showing trades, positions, and profits that mostly never existed. That's it! Money came in. Money went out. Paperwork filled the gap. Madoff told clients he was using a strategy often described as a split-strike conversion approach. It sounded technical enough to reassure people and complicated enough to discourage casual questions. Most clients were not going to sit down and reconstruct the options market themselves. They heard a sophisticated strategy, saw consistent performance, and moved on. But the real product was not investment management. It was the appearance of investment management. Picture a client opening a statement at the end of the month. Maybe their account supposedly started the year at $2.4 million, and now it shows a smooth gain. Not a crazy jump, just another neat, reassuring step upward. A few trades listed, positions that look plausible, the kind of paperwork that feels too structured to be fake. That's what made the scheme so effective. Most frauds overreach. They promise 30%, 40%, 50% returns and trigger suspicion. Madoff did almost the opposite. He offered returns that were good enough to attract money, but boring enough to look believable. Around 10% to 12% annually, over and over, with remarkably little volatility. In a chaotic market, boring becomes seductive. If everyone else is getting bruised and one person seems to have discovered a way to make money feel smooth, people stop asking whether the smoothness itself is the warning sign. why people believed it. This is the part people love to simplify. They say, how could anyone fall for that? But that question is easier to ask after the collapse than before it, because people were not trusting some anonymous stranger on the internet. They were trusting a man with status, connections, and social proof stacked in every direction. Madoff's investors included wealthy families, charitable foundations, feeder funds, and institutions. There were sophisticated people in the mix, people with lawyers, accountants, analysts, boards, committees. And once that kind of crowd gathers around something, a powerful social shortcut takes over. If all these serious people believe it, maybe the work of believing has already been done for me. That is herd psychology, but it doesn't feel like herd psychology when you're inside it. It feels like prudence. It feels like joining the vetted option. Then there was exclusivity. This was not marketed like a mass product. You often got in through a referral, a connection, a social circle, a private introduction, a friend at a club, a family office contact, a trusted wealth manager. That made the investment feel less like a transaction and more like access. And people rarely interrogate access when they're afraid of losing it. Imagine a dinner in Palm Beach or Manhattan. One person mentions they've been with Madoff for 15 years. Another says their foundation uses him. A third says he doesn't take everyone. But someone can maybe make an introduction. Nobody wants to be the awkward person at the table saying, "Can we independently verify all of this?" That question doesn't just sound skeptical. In that environment, it sounds socially clumsy. So the room does what rooms often do. It mistakes consensus for proof. And once enough wealthy, connected, apparently sophisticated people are inside the same story, the story starts defending itself. The warning signs. Now comes the part that should make this story feel less like a mystery and more like an institutional failure. Because the fraud was not invisible. People noticed things. People raised alarms. People put concerns in writing. The best-known example is Harry Markopolos, the financial analyst who began looking at Madoff's returns in 1999. He didn't need years to get suspicious. The numbers looked wrong almost immediately. Madoff's reported performance was too steady, too clean, too mathematically convenient for the strategy he claimed to be using. So Markopolos did the work. He and his team analyzed the returns, examined the supposed options activity, and concluded that the numbers simply did not make sense. In plain English, the strategy Madoff described could not realistically produce the results Madoff was reporting. And Markopolos did not keep that to himself. He went to the SEC multiple times. In 2000, in 2001, and again in 2005, including a memo titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He laid out two broad possibilities. Either Madoff was engaged in some other serious misconduct, or he was running a Ponzi scheme. Either way, something was deeply wrong. The SEC received the warnings, and still, the fraud kept going. That is one of the most disturbing parts of this story. Not that one man lied, but that the system had multiple chances to press harder and didn't. There were other clues too. Industry professionals looked at the volume of options Madoff would have needed to trade and realized the market data did not line up. The positions on paper were too large, too smooth, too cleanly executed. People who understood the plumbing of markets could see that parts of the story did not fit the actual pipes. But a famous name plus a complex-looking strategy plus weak follow-through created a kind of protective fog. The warning lights were on. No one shut the machine down. The collapse. In the end, the fraud did not die because regulators brilliantly exposed it. It died because it ran out of oxygen. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, everything changed. Markets were falling hard. Fear was everywhere. Investors across the world started pulling money from funds, banks, and managers because they needed liquidity, safety, or simply cash. Madoff's investors did the same thing. Suddenly, the machine faced roughly $7 billion in redemption requests, and that was the number it could not survive, because there was no giant portfolio sitting there waiting to be liquidated. No real pile of assets matching the statements. No deep reserve of legitimate gains. The money had already been recycled, spent, distributed, and fictionalized. A Ponzi scheme can look stable for years as long as new money keeps arriving and outgoing demands stay manageable. But it has one fatal weakness. It cannot survive a rush to the exits. Think of it like a theater set, built to look like a real building. From the front, it seems solid. Doors, windows, structure. But the moment everyone leans on it at once, it tips over because there was never a real building there. That was 2008. In December of that year, Madoff told his sons the truth. They reported him to authorities the next day. Federal agents arrested him shortly after. After decades of apparent sophistication, the ending was brutally simple. People asked for money. The money wasn't there. The aftermath. The scale of the damage is still hard to absorb. Loss estimates vary depending on whether you count the fake profits shown on statements or only the actual cash investors put in, but prosecutors described it as the largest Ponzi scheme in history. The paper losses were often cited in the range of $50 billion to $65 billion. Actual principal losses were lower, but still enormous. And the victims were not abstract. They were retirees who thought their later years were funded, charities that suddenly couldn't operate, families that had trusted not just Madoff, but the people who had vouched for Madoff. Some investors had their entire financial identity wrapped inside those monthly statements. On paper, they thought they had $8 million or $14 million, or enough to support a foundation, a family, a future. Then, in a matter of days, that paper wealth dissolved. Imagine being a couple in your late 60s, looking at statements for years that say you're secure, and then discovering the account was largely an illusion. Your plans for retirement, gifts to children, healthcare, philanthropy, all of it suddenly has to be repriced against reality. That is not just financial damage. That is psychological violence. Madoff pleaded guilty in 2009 and received a 150-year federal prison sentence. He died in prison in 2021 at age 82. After that came the long, messy recovery process. A court-appointed trustee spent years clawing back money from those who had withdrawn more than they originally invested. That meant some people who thought they had merely taken legitimate profits were told to return funds because those profits had actually come from other victims' principal. The Justice Department later distributed more than $1.5 billion to tens of thousands of victims, but for many people, recovery was only partial. Even after money was recovered, something else remained broken. Trust. Trust in reputations. Trust in gatekeepers. Trust in the idea that if enough serious people are involved, someone, somewhere, must have done the real checking. The real lesson. Bernie Madoff did not build the biggest fraud in history by acting like a cartoon villain. He built it by understanding what frightened wealthy people most. They were not just afraid of losing money. They were afraid of uncertainty, volatility, embarrassment, missing out on the safe, sophisticated option that other insiders seemed to understand. So Madoff sold the emotional opposite of chaos. He sold calm. He sold consistency. He sold the feeling that somebody serious was quietly handling things while the rest of the world panicked. That is why this case still matters, because the most dangerous frauds rarely present themselves as wild opportunities. They present themselves as relief. They look like the answer to the exact thing people are anxious about. If markets are unstable, the fraud offers stability. If the financial world feels confusing, the fraud offers simplicity. If access feels elite, the fraud uses exclusivity to make scrutiny feel rude. And that leads to the part that matters most. Steady returns are not proof of safety. Sometimes they are the thing that should make you most uncomfortable. A famous name is not the same thing as transparency. In fact, fame often becomes the shield that keeps transparency from ever being demanded. And the most important question in investing is often the least socially comfortable one. Can this be independently verified? Not admired, not trusted, not explained beautifully. Verified, because the Madoff scheme lasted so long for a very human reason, it looked less like a crime than like a solution. It looked like order in a disorderly world. It looked like certainty in a system full of doubt. Right up until people asked for the money. And the money wasn't there.